By the end of January 1943, the Australians had pushed the Japanese out of the eastern tip of New Guinea, and the US Marines and Army were starting to overcome the Japanese at Guadalcanal. So it would be time to go on the offensive. The Australians fought with great spirit to get one over on the Japanese in the early battles of the Southwest Pacific. But it had major problems with both training and equipment and leadership. Before the Australians went on the offensive in the rest of New Guinea, the army would need training in jungle warfare and go into combat with the correct uniforms, not shorts and short-sleeve shirts, making the Australian infantry possibly the best jungle fighters of World War II. One of the most respected British generals, General Bill Slim, read all the reports of the Australians, and for all their poor equipment and in the main lack of experience, they stopped the Japanese and proved it was no Superman. And he passed this on to British troops and Indian troops in India and the Burma border. If the boys from down under can do it, so can you. Even as the Australians were slogging it out with the Japanese in late 1942, the Australian Army saw the need for effective jungle training, and in late 1942 formed the Land Headquarters Training Centre Jungle Warfare at, I think it's called Canungra in Queensland. The tough course was approximately 3 weeks and trained day and night for up to 14 hours in a 24-hour period, covering subjects such as living and operating in the jungle environment, plus specialist jungle equipment and small unit tactics and lessons from experienced troops from the Kokoda Trail and Milne Bay, which included the use of automatic weapons such as the Owen submachine gun that would remain in Australian service until the 1970s. As we are chatting, behind me is film of Australians training. Notice the better uniform and the famous slouch hat used by both Australians and British in the jungle. Officers commanding troops in the jungle received up to 6 weeks training at the centre, including everything the soldiers did on their course, plus leadership, jungle logistics, and the use of natives as trackers and communications. The training school is still there today, and the Australian Armed Forces have a fantastic reputation for operating in the jungles of the world, and this paid dividends in Vietnam, where they operated far better than US troops in the jungles earlier in the war. The Matilda II Tank by late 1942 was considered obsolete by the British, but the Australians needed a tank, so about 400 Matilda IIs were sent to Australia to form the Australian Armoured Corps and were soon in actions in the jungles of the Southwest Pacific, supporting Australian infantry. The Australians did quite a lot of modification to the Matilda, including waterproofing and putting in forwarding equipment, infantry telephone on the back to communicate with the crew, and protect them from Japanese weapons that could cause a fire on the back end of the tank, as fire was the main problem for the crews, as the Japanese could rarely penetrate the Matilda's thick armour. The size of the tank and its low weight of about 25 tonnes made it ideal for jungle warfare, and its slow speed of just 15 miles an hour didn't really matter, as it had massive torque from its twin diesel engines that would literally smash through the jungle. It was just what the infantrymen needed from a tank. The Australians actually preferred the 3-inch high explosive gun rather than the 2-pounder when dealing with Japanese strong points. And it could be fitted onto the much smaller landing craft, which was important for moving around lots of these small islands that you find in the Southwest Pacific area. The Matilda II Tank would serve the Australian Army fighting in the Southwest Pacific until the last days of the Second World War, making it the only British tank to see service from 1939 to 1945 in frontline operations. In fact, there are very few tanks from any nation that served like the Matilda II all over the world. It truly was the Queen of the Desert, the saviour of Moscow, and the King of the Jungle. The Australian Army, along with their fellow Anzacs from New Zealand, would fight with tenacity throughout the rest of the Southwest Pacific campaign, bringing their expertise in jungle warfare to the fight, but not always appreciated by General MacArthur, who generally thought negatively about the Australians for most of the war. Most of the fighting by the Australian Army in the Pacific was in New Guinea, but they would also fight in New Britain and at Bougainville, and in 1945 take part in the Borneo campaign. In the end, the Australians would lose some 18,000 killed in the Pacific in action, not including 6,000 or 7,000 that died in captivity by the Japanese after the 21,000 had been captured in and around Singapore and Malaya. Finally, in this episode, we shall look briefly at Australian Special Forces and intelligence units that operated in the Pacific in World War II. At the start of the war, the Australians had hardly any intel units and relied on British intelligence. But by 1942, had formed with the US a joint signal intelligence unit that would expand to over 4,000 by the end of the war. The Australian Army formed its own commando units as early as 1941 with the help of British commandos like Mike Calvert. Many were trained at the School for Jungle Warfare. They would operate throughout the Pacific area, including guerrilla tactics in Timor. Known from 1944 as cavalry commandos, 3 regiments were formed with 9 squadrons overall. They undertook flank protection and deep recce patrols, but towards the end of the war were misused as elite infantry in Borneo and Bougainville. Finally was mentioned M and Z units. M units were joint intel units from Australia, New Zealand, Britain and the Netherlands, and carried out tasks such as coast watching. Z units, or Z Force, which were a joint service clandestine unit carrying out long-range raids and reconnaissance and sabotage. The most famous of these was Operation Jaywick, which targeted Japanese shipping in Singapore, sinking 3 used ships, with units getting away and all getting back. The follow-up operation was a bit of a disaster, with running gun battles with the Japanese and heroic escape attempts, with some covering 2,000 miles before capture. But these were not only captured, interrogated and brutally executed. In episode 2, we shall see the Allies on the offensive in the Southwest Pacific, including the battle for the Bismarck Sea with the Royal Australian Air Force and the JFK incident.